Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Samuel Bazzi. Hello, Sam. How are you doing? How are you doing, Sam?
I'm good, Lipton. How are you?
I'm great. So, Sam, you recently published an article that confirmed the frontier thesis. Who was Frederick Jack Turner Jackson?
Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian who was writing in the late 1800s and early 1900s um, about sort of popular themes in American history and trying to kind of connect America's unique frontier settlement experience with a whole range of kind of cultural and political attributes of this kind of fast growing country in during the 1800s. Um, and the famous his famous thesis was an article he delivered in 1893 at a meeting of the American Historical Association in Chicago, and it sort of caught like wildfire and set off, about 100 plus years of infighting among historians and other social scientists, trying to kind of grapple with, a lot of the details and lack of details in some respects of many of his arguments.
And what was his thesis?
So his thesis, if you could kind of sum it up in one statement, was simply that the frontier, this kind of ever-moving westward frontier, um, had profound effects on the development of a kind of national culture in America. And what that culture was, in his view, was one sort of rooted in democratic ideals and individualism and kind of the uh, this opposition to big government and government intervention in private economic in the pursuit of kind of economic um, economic well-being at the individual level.
Yeah, so Frederick Jackson Turner argued that frontier societies lead to individualism. Sam, what is a frontier society?
So it's a place. I mean, if we talk very specifically about the kind of way that he thought about it, and the way that the Census Bureau in the late 1800s was actually like quantifying it for the first time, it was really these places that you could kind of see as the edge of settlement. So America's moving west. And at the very kind of edge of that westward settlement, you're seeing population density measured, at the county level or some smaller unit, falling below 2 people per square mile. And so that was sort of the cutoff that the census used, and based on kind of staring at maps, and the definition that Turner adopted. And so you might be thinking, what's special about two people per square mile? That seems fairly arbitrary. And it turns out something that we were able to document quite convincingly, is that there's something quite substantive that's happening at these very, once you move sort of past 2 to 6 people per square mile. Effectively, the kind of structure, the demographic structure of society is changing in pretty remarkable ways. So at really low levels of population density out on the westward frontier, you're seeing disproportionate number of males in the local population. These are male-dominated societies. You're seeing relatively more prime age adults, fewer kind of very old people and fewer very young people. You're seeing a greater prevalence of what look to be names that we would think of as more individualistic and less sort of conformist in a kind of national or regional sense. And then so that's at the individual level, and then kind of at the institutional level, you see just much less presence of the state. So you see smaller government in terms of its taxation capacity. You see smaller presence of government institutions like post offices and kind of other arms of the state. And so, it's this kind of confluence of very unique demographic structure and a weak kind of institutional presence that really characterizes, I think, life in these frontier communities that kind of continually moving west.
Sam, I read your paper. Comment some more, please, on the demographic structure of the frontier society.
So, I think what the way we sort of tried to characterize it is really in terms of the gender composition. I think is an important one. These, and you see this sort of in lots of frontier societies. It's not just unique to the U.S. I mean, if you look at the settlement of Australia, for example, they're just very skewed sex ratios. These were really kind of, these are dangerous places. There's all sorts of risks. There's a lot of violence, and it's really, to kind of put it crudely, it's really very much kind of a man's world. And so you definitely see that sort of skew it's very apparent in the census data. And then the other things that you see are just consistent with that sort of nature of life on the frontier. You are seeing this greater prevalence of able-bodied adults, if we could call them that, which again is kind of reflects the kind of difficult economic environment and difficulties of life out on the frontier. And we didn't do too much to kind of characterize fertility, but because it's difficult for a lot of reasons to kind of measure fertility carefully in some of the really early rounds of the U.S. Census. But we did have some suggestive evidence that for those who were getting married and having children, they were having much larger families than people in the eastern, more settled parts of the country. And so I'm happy to kind of elaborate on anything more specific than that, or talk concretely about the way we're trying to characterize individualism. But yeah, just let me know.
Yeah, please elaborate.
Yeah, so I mean, on the in terms of I guess another kind of feature that's not in our not in the paper that we published, but it's something that we're kind of actively trying to explore at the moment, is religion. And so one thing that we can see, for example, is that there seems to be in these frontier communities, there seems to be a higher share of sort of non-mainstream religions. And so you definitely see a little bit of that. And what was mainstream at which point in time kind of varies over the 19th century, of course, and beyond. But you do see sort of a little bit of that kind of religious differentiation among some of these communities. And then the other thing that you see quite prominently is a greater prevalence of immigrants. And it's not the case that I know some people sometimes have this impression that it's all kind of European immigrants driving the westward expansion, and they're like the largest share of the population out on the frontier. And that was certainly true in some places, but I think from what we can see, it looks like the typical kind of frontier county in the 1800s had about 15% immigrant, relative to the non-frontier kind of eastern settled parts of the country, where the average county had about 7 or 8% immigrant, up until the 1880s, basically. And so you do see that there are more immigrants in these places as a share of the population, but it's not sort of they're by no means sort of the majority in most of the frontier and most of the period. And I think one other important feature of kind of life on the frontier is that we can corroborate in the data, and as corroborate basically what historians observed about the frontier is that there seems to be a lot less inequality. We can see this in terms of land holdings and some other measures of wealth in certain periods, and you can definitely see that it's a lot more equal in terms of the distribution of land across across the population in these frontier communities. And so that's kind of all on the demographic side. And then, one thing we do is try to characterize the prevalence of individualism. Today we have great survey data and kind of lots of creative ways to kind of measure individualism, but historically it's very difficult to kind of imagine how one might do this. And so what we did was basically borrow from social psychologists who have been arguing for some time now, and some sociologists as well, that one can infer a signal of individualistic preferences and kind of culture by seeing parents giving their kids names that aren't more common in society at large. And so you see a lot more of those types of kind of unique or infrequent names being given to kids born in frontier communities than you do for kids born in non-frontier, more established communities in the East.
Sam, you're an economist. I studied history, but I appreciate economics, and I think it would be fascinating for you or any of your colleagues to do a study on the relationship between names and outcomes. I know that there are some studies arguing that people with black sounding names are less likely to be employed, but there are not studies looking at the history of names and their relationship to income over a longer period of time. So for instance, in the Caribbean during slavery, the enslaved preferred to reflect the names of prominent citizens, even when they were white. So if the governor was called Saint Augustine, the slave would call himself Saint Augustine or Nero, because in African culture, names represented power and it was argued that they could shape one's destiny. So the issue of naming is quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really fascinating. And we tried to do a little bit of this in the paper, but at the very kind of end, when we were making some kind of suggestive correlations and kind of laying the ground for potentially for future work. But you do see, for example, that on the frontier, have those that are giving their kids individualistic names, i.e. those individualistic parents themselves, they seem to be have kind of higher occupational standing than people giving their kids individualistic names in more settled parts of the country where individualism might not be as kind of rewarded in an economic sense. And so, I think we do see some suggestive elements of that. And then I'd say the other area where you see a lot of interesting work on these questions about the returns to name choices in the historical era is in terms of giving your kids American sounding names for immigrants. And so there is some nice work by Leah Bustan and Ron Abramitsky and co-authors, if I'm not remembering, who show that giving your kid an American sounding name has payoffs kind of later in life once they enter the labor market. And this is looking kind of in the early 1900s. So I think there's a kind of growing. You're absolutely right, Lipton. I think there's a growing appreciation that of the power of names, and I think we're, now that we have this historical census data, there's more and more kind of creative attempts to understand what's in a name effectively.
No, so African American sounding names, for example, were favorable in the past, but not today. And I'm assuming that this is a consequence of Black social capital. So people were more invested in the Black community they would name their children in honor of great Black figures and individuals who were divested from the Black community. In other words, those with less social capital would not have given their children African sounding names. So
Hmm.
historically, African American sounding names benefited Black Americans. But today, the evidence is telling us something different.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely.
But
Yeah.
based on the studies that I've read, I think the issue is a is an effect of classism. Some predominantly Black sounding names in America are associated with people from a particular socioeconomic status. So employers could be discriminating against people on the basis of class and not necessarily race.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And that's kind of the challenge of, when figuring out how much of it is statistical versus taste-based discrimination, as economists would call it, and that's really kind of I think the real challenge in a lot of those types of studies. Yeah, no, that's
Yeah, one study, I believe it was done by Fryer, it said that African American sounding names are correlated with social pathologies. So maybe employers are saying that if your name is Shamika, you could be the mother of three children and their father is not around. So preferences are really important because in the business world, even today, uh, em- entrepreneurs prefer individuals who have a certain taste and outlook. So I think
Sure.
it's really a consequence of class, not really race.
Yeah, no, that's that's I'm a bit reluctant to speak like too forcefully about these things because I'm not an expert
Mm.
on race-based discrimination, but no, I think you're certainly onto something.
And you could also study the naming practices of celebrities. They tend to give their children outlandish names.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, yeah.
This could be a proxy for innovation. People who are open to new ideas don't care that their name sounds a bit crazy.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, I think there is a growing interest, and this hypothesis has been around a long time about the link between individualism and innovation. And so, there's actually some work that other folks have been doing, kind of using our variation, and some work that we're in the process of doing at the moment as well, trying to understand that possible link that you just alluded to.
Mm. Yeah, I interviewed Gerard Rowland as a guest some time ago.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So it's motivated by some of his work, in fact. Yeah.
But you said that you're working on new research and some people were influenced by your present work. So I'm assuming that there are other individuals studying innovation.
Yes. No, absolutely. So there's two studies that I'm familiar with um, that are using our measure of frontier history in each county in the U.S. And so one is basically linking. Basically showing that there's higher levels of entrepreneurial entry.
Who are the
uh,
writers? Who are the authors?
Barrios is the first author. I'm forgetting who the rest are.
Yeah.
Barrios.
Yeah, I'm familiar
Um,
with that name.
okay, yeah. So they have a nice paper showing that the title is kind of clever. I mean, they call it rugged entrepreneurs basically, and show I think fairly convincingly that in places with greater frontier experience historically, like these places today have higher levels of entrepreneurship. Um, and after kind of controlling for basic fundamentals of the place in terms of how suitable it is to different types of economic activities, which of course could be an important confounder of entrepreneurship. And then another one that I just came across, I think it's very new, and I don't even remember the authors. I'd have to follow up with you later. Showing that CEOs who come from counties, who are born in counties that have greater frontier experience, those CEOs, the firms that they're leading, tend to be more innovative and patent more often. I think their argument has to do with the kind of culture of the corporate culture that they create, and kind of the incentives for innovation that these CEOs are kind of embedding in organizational structures. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in this space. And then what we're working on with Christian Fons Rosen and Enrico Burkis, who are have a lot of experience on questions about innovation and kind of historical patenting. We're basically trying to understand how at an individual level, like looking at individual inventors and trying to understand whether there's kind of whether there's any time varying kind of relationship between frontier culture that you kind of inherit from the place you grew up and your innovativeness as seen through patenting over over about 150-year period. And what's interesting there is that if we think about the nature of innovation historically, in the very early years of America and sort of the early years of industrialization, one could imagine that innovation was happening at a very individual level. I mean, sitting around with tools and pen and paper in your garage or your workshop. And fast forward to the 1980s and 90s and kind of the tech revolution that's happened, and a lot more innovation is happening in teams, where one could imagine that individualistic types of behavior and attitudes and approaches might actually be a hindrance to innovation, just given the complexity and of what innovation looks like at the technological frontier today. And so I think, so we're basically trying to understand whether innovation, whether individualism may have favored innovation historically, when the nature of technology was much less complex in some ways than it is today.
According to accounts I have surveyed, individualism is the most robust cultural predictor of economic performance, and historically, inventors were innovative. Teams were also a part of innovation in the future, but back then there was greater deference to highly educated and eccentric people who would unleash brilliant innovations. I think that the issue is that today people tend to downplay the role of the great man. Most people are skeptical of the great man's most people are skeptical of the great man perspective in history. There are flaws inherent in this perspective, but again, highly intelligent people with particular personality traits are more likely to innovate. So I'm not too quick to downplay the crucial role of the great man in history.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think it's something that we'll hopefully, have a better handle on probably towards summer of next year. Working with the historical patenting data and linking it to the individuals in the census is a pretty Herculean task. And so it's quite a big enterprise to kind of make this work in an empirical sense, so that we can kind of test some of these ideas. But that's where we're headed.
And creating a culture of innovation is difficult. Studies show that a culture of innovation is a better predictor. Yes, I'm correct. A culture of innovation is a better predictor of inventing than spending on R&D.
Yeah.
In order to spend on R&D, one must appreciate innovation.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And yeah, so this new study on CEOs and kind of the corporate culture and differences in with individualistic versus non-individualistic CEOs, I think might speak a little bit to that. Yeah.
Yes, there's a link between individualism and entrepreneurship, but I am interested in opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, because the nexus between entrepreneurship and economic growth is negative. It becomes positive when we account for opportunity-driven entrepreneurship. So I have been doing some research to ascertain if there are studies examining the relationship between individualism and opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, or cultures that are receptive to opportunity-driven entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And in fact, I discussed the Barrios paper last summer. I think it's a fantastic paper. One comment I had was exactly along those lines. Like, I think we want to be able to distinguish between what you're calling opportunity entrepreneurship and what I gather the entrepreneurship literature is increasingly calling subsistence entrepreneurship. Sort of people pushed into it because of a lack of opportunity. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that that's kind of the distinction that's very important in making sense of whether this is actually driven by kind of innovative potential or just out of sheer necessity due to lack of opportunity.
Entrepreneurship is a value creating process. One accumulates wealth after creating value. Necessity driven entrepreneurs start businesses to evade the minimum wage. So I'm a fan of the GEM, the Global Entrepreneur Monitor. So I live in Jamaica. I'm a Jamaican, and in Jamaica it is often said that the people are entrepreneurial. But in my latest article published on Substack, Jamaica was not examined, but I made a reference to Jamaica and I debunked that view. According to a study done by David B. Aldrich and his co-authors, in terms of unproductive entrepreneurship, Jamaica is in the top 5 in the world. Jamaicans are hustlers, not necessarily entrepreneurship, not necessarily entrepreneurs. And there's actually a study saying that in Jamaica, people start businesses to evade the minimum wage. So these are necessity-driven businesses that are unlikely to drive Schumpeterian growth.
Yes, yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to take a look at that article.
Yeah, the piece published by Audrey Tish is online. You can locate it on Springer, and the other article was published in Jamaica. It was published in a Jamaican publication.
Okay. Yep.
But I am fascinated by entrepreneurship, and I think one of the reasons why so many people are mesmerized by the event of entrepreneurship is due to the success of people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Entrepreneurs have always been important, but the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilt were not celebrities.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And certainly Zuckerberg and Musk have they have their fan base, but probably an equally large base of folks who aren't fans. So yeah, no,
I'm fond of technological innovations.
Yeah.
But interestingly, those who are arguing that capitalism is changing for the worse can locate some evidence by looking at IPOs. Historically, companies were highly valued when they produce substantive products that the market demands. Today, young people start a business, there's a valuation and an IPO. The business is valued at 2 billion or 3 billion, and the company is making 20 million. Yeah. They're these really crazy valuations.
Yes. Yeah. It's hard to know. I mean, even Tesla, right? Like,
yeah, Tesla as the track record of Tesla is unimpressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I don't have a problem with investing in Tesla. I like to buy stocks, and I'm planning to get some US stocks. If I were to purchase Tesla, obviously, I want it to perform at a high level. But if we're being serious, the track record is unimpressive. Just like Rivian. Rivian did an IPO. It was highly valued, but Rivian is not really making money.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another area of research for people like yourself. Why are these valuations so crazy?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, the company is making 20 million, but its CEO is a billionaire. I can understand why, but I wasn't expecting it to happen so quickly in our lifetime.
Yeah, sure. Sure. No, it's it's the great mystery.
Yeah, but back to your paper. Earlier, you established that inequality was low in frontier societies, and that's an unsurprising observation. for this particular reason. In individualistic societies, people have the potential to produce on their own. The government is not creating an impediment. So because more opportunities are available to create wealth, I'm expecting income inequality to be lower. And there's actually a paper by Boris Nikolaev and his co-authors titled Are Individualistic Societies Less Equal?
Mhm.
Evidence from the Parasite Stress Theory of Values.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that specific paper, but I can imagine exactly the design that they're using. But yeah, no, it's certainly not a surprising fact. I mean, this is exactly what we were expecting to see, um, and and it lines up with the historical narratives and the sort of underlying economic theory that you just nicely articulated. So
Yeah. This is one of the topics that can never get old. Individualism. This is something I've discussed quite frequently on the show.
mm,
Intelligence, and I've written on monarchy, and I'm planning to interview some writers who have produced empirical studies, noting that monarchies are superior to democracies and autocracies.
mm,
But I'm really passionate in the field. I'm really passionate about individualism, and for obvious reasons. I think that I'm quite eccentric.
yeah.
So I was interviewing an academic once, and I said, I'm in a random country in the Caribbean, not known for economics or science, and I'm interviewing you. Is that statistically possible? And then I'm not really from a rich background, and she was a distinguished economist. Yeah, so I like to ask these personal questions.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, you've heard this saying, research is me search.
No, I'm not familiar with the saying.
Oh yeah, it's I mean, they say I think some people are skeptical of research that's driven by kind of personal interests and like vested kind of personal background and interests. Because the concern is that you can't be sufficiently dispassionate to produce quality objective work. And I think there might be some truth to that on some topics, but I also think that having kind of a either intrinsic or extrinsic like source of personal motivation for the topic you're studying, based on your own kind of personal background, I think it can also be like a very profound source of inspiration and creativity. And so I think I think it's certainly a big driver of some of the questions I study. And so I'm not surprised to hear someone like yourself having a similar interest in individualism
Yeah, Jamaica is not a wealthy country, so as a little boy, I often wondered why are some countries rich and other countries are poor. So I read David Landis, and since then I've never looked back. Yes.
Yeah,
So,
no, great.
so when the greater the passion, the higher the commitment.
Yes, exactly.
But
Exactly.
but back to your paper. In individualism and trust, did you come across anything in the data that purported a link between individualism and trust?
I'm trying to think. I mean, it certainly didn't show up in the paper. There is survey data that one could use to explore this link, and I'd be willing to bet. I wouldn't put any money on this because I'm not a betting man, but I'd be my strong prior is that
Positive. The relationship is
yeah,
positive.
well, it depends what kind of trust you're talking about. So I think if we're talking about in-group trust, so trust in my like immediate community, trust in my family for sure. I think those would be, especially the family, of course, I think those would be very strong. But as you kind of move further and further away from the family unit and start thinking about like out-group trust and kind of generalized social trust, to let alone trust in the government, I think those are going to be kind of those would potentially be negatively correlated. And these are things we can test with modern survey data at least. So I think Yeah, I think that would definitely be an interesting direction one could go with.
Yeah, and I also want you to talk about the relationship between individualism and the lack of support for redistribution.
Yeah, absolutely. So this connection between individualism and kind of opposition to taxation and to redistribution is something that folks have pointed out in various parts of the political economy literature for some time, and I think the idea is that I'm a self-reliant individual. I believe I have a strong belief in the importance of effort in generating income in my life as opposed to luck. And so, I don't want the government coming in and taxing away that effort that I view as my path to upward mobility. And so once I've realized some of these returns to effort as a self-reliant individualist, I'm going to be, quite opposed to the government taking money that I've earned and giving it to other members of society. Now, and especially when it's some faraway government giving money to some faraway people and communities far removed from my own, and that I might have very little trust of, going back to thinking about kind of generalized social trust. And so I think that's kind of a big part of I think there's a really tight connection between individualism and opposition to taxation and redistribution in this in when we think about kind of the structure of the public finance in this country, where a lot of the kind of local, the taxation that's happening from the federal government is taking money earned locally and redistributing it nationally, potentially quite far away from your own community. And I think it's that sort of disconnect that is driving some of that kind of opposition opposition to taxation and redistribution.
Excellent points. And I also want you to shed some light on land abundance and its relationship to social mobility in the context of your paper.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Now, of course, a big part of what was happening historically in the process of westward expansion was the dispossession of the indigenous population, and this is something that we've actually been doing some work on after the paper came out, and we've sort of found ways to measure some of this process of dispossession and creating land abundance for the white population moving west. And what you can certainly see this abundance materializing, and I think that's in part what was drawing a lot of the settlers from the eastern parts of the country, where land inequality sort of dynamics, some of which kind of happen through political means, but some of which just kind of happen naturally and organically in the process of economic growth and structural change. I think some of that was, pushing people out west in search of land, and in search of land in land in the presence of land abundance. You could have a more equitable distribution of land, and given that I'm an individualist and I'm thinking, I believe in the importance of effort in generating income, I'm very drawn to the possibility of having my own land and working the land and kind of extracting value from the land in a way that I couldn't do in the more densely populated parts of the country, the settled parts of the country out east. So I certainly think that was a big part of it. I mean, without the land abundance, which of course was created in part by dispossession of the native peoples, I think that that was fundamental to the westward expansion, and fundamental to the kind of instantiation of this individualistic culture in these places.
And they also oppose regulations.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's all kind of connected to this, I think, a more general kind of anti-statism, opposition to uh, opposition to kind of government intervention in the private pursuit of economic gain. And so we can definitely see this materializing in terms of political preferences over the long run, and seeing a lot of these attitudes in more modern survey data. And so the people, still living in these places in the late 20th century, in these, places that were on the frontier for a longer period of time historically, they're very much opposed to, at least on average, much more opposed to a variety of forms of government regulation. And so, and the types of opposition can be linked to, some of these notions about what it is that's driving this individualistic culture. So again, thinking about things like effort versus luck, in income generation, and kind of opposition to the minimum wage. Thinking about this notion of manifest destiny and land abundance, and not being told that you can't settle this land and do what you will with it. And then you can kind of trace that attitude to some of the opposition to climate regulation to today. And then, a variety of other kind of general opposition to the regulatory kind of advance of the state into new domains of economic life.
So, Sam, I really enjoyed this paper, but we have to move on. And briefly, we will speak about your second paper, Unity in Diversity. You studied Indonesia. Most studies covering diversity often argue that it is negatively related to social trust and support for welfare. But in Indonesia, the results are quite different. So just comment on their findings briefly.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's an important distinction that until work by de Ray and Joan Esteban, most people who had worked on diversity hadn't really appreciated the nuance. And so here's the distinction. So, and this proved to be quite important in generating some of those positive relationships in our study that you don't see in other work. So there's really two dimensions of diversity that are important in thinking about some of these kind of political economy type outcomes. So one is what's popularly called fractionalization, and the other is polarization. And these are really capturing two distinct things. The way to think about fractionalization is that it's going to be higher when we have many small groups in society. So there's just lots of small groups, and at the limit, everyone is their own. In a perfectly fractionalized society, every individual has their own kind of identity. In polarized, by contrast, in polarized communities, these are places where there are a few small groups. Right. And so and those are two very different types of communities. Right. And so what we're able to show is that in communities that have many small groups, you see greater integration, greater kind of cohesion around the national identity, greater social trust, greater kind of public good provision. And then when you look at polarized communities with a few small groups, maybe two or three kind of roughly equally sized large groups, you see the exact opposite. You see greater kind of attachment to one's ethnic identity, lower social trust, greater ethnic conflict, less public good provision. But what's key is that you have to kind of embed both of those kind of dimensions of diversity into the same empirical design, if you want to be able to like disentangle these different types of communities in the same kind of regression framework.
All right. So I read both of your papers. They're quite interesting. The Indonesian story is not known to many. You were talking about the transmigration scheme.
Yeah.
That's not one of the more popular stories in history.
Right. Yeah.
Over Sam, I am enjoying the conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up because of the time. But it
Okay.
was a pleasure to speak to you, Sam. All right
You
then,
too,
bye.
Evan. Great. Good talking to you.